kind there may have been, Shakespeare cast himself on the ground, and felt unworthy and alien in the presence of the aspect and virtue of Brutus. He has inscribed the testimony thereof in the tragedy itself. He has twice brought in a poet in it, and twice heaped upon him such an impatient and extreme contempt, that it sounds like a cry of self-contempt. Brutus, even Brutus loses patience when the poet appears, self-important, pathetic, and obtrusive, as poets usually are, persons who seem to abound in the possibilities of greatness, even moral greatness, and nevertheless rarely attain even to ordinary uprightness in the philosophy of practice and of life. "He may know the times, but I know his temper! Away with the jigging fool!" shouts Brutus. We may translate this back into the soul of the poet that composed it. 99. The followers of Schopenhauer. What one sees at the contact of civilized peoples with barbarians, namely, that the lower civilization regularly accepts in the first place the vices, weaknesses, and excesses of the higher, then, from that point onwards, feels the influence of a charm, and finally by means of the appropriated vices and weaknesses, also allows something of the valuable influence of the higher culture to leave in it. One can also see this close at hand, and without journeys to barbarian peoples, to be sure, somewhat refined and spiritualized, and not so readily palpable. What are the German followers of Schopenhauer still accustomed to receive first of all from their master? Those who, when placed beside his superior culture, must deem themselves sufficiently barbarous to be first of all barbarously fascinated and seduced by him. Is it his hard matter-of-fact sense, his inclination to clearness and rationality, which often makes him appear so English and so unlike Germans? Or the strength of his intellectual conscience, which endured a lifelong contradiction of "being" and "willing," and compelled him to contradict himself constantly, even in his writings on almost every point? Or his purity in the matters relating to the Church and the Christian God? For here he was too pure as no German philosopher had been hitherto, so that he lived and died "as a Voltairean." Or his immortal doctrines of the intellectuality of intuition, the a priori of the law of causality, the instrumental nature of the intellect, and the non-freedom of the will? No, nothing of this enchants, nor is felt as enchanting. But Schopenhauer's mystical embarrassments and shufflings in those passages where the matter-of-fact thinker allowed himself to be seduced and corrupted by the vain impulse to be the unraveller of the world's riddle, this undemonstrable doctrine of one will (all causes are merely occasional causes of the phenomenon of the will at such time and at such a place), the will to live, whole and undivided, is present in every living being, even in the smallest, as perfectly as in the sum of all that was, is, and will be. His denial of the individual (all lions are really only one lion), the plurality of individuals is an appearance, as also development is only an appearance. He calls the opinion of Lamarck "an ingenious, absurd error," his fantasy about genius quote, in aesthetic contemplation, the individual is no longer an individual, but a pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge. Quote, the subject, in that it entirely merges in the contemplated object, has become this object itself. His nonsense about sympathy, about the outburst of the principium individuationis, thus rendered possible, as the source of all morality, including also such assertions as dying is really the design of existence, the possibility should not be absolutely denied that the magical effect could proceed from a person already dead. These and similar extravagances and vices of the philosopher are always first accepted and made articles of faith, for vices and extravagances are always easier to imitate, and do not require a long preliminary practice. But let us speak of the most celebrated of the living Schopenhauerians, Richard Wagner. It has happened to him, as it has already happened to many an artist, that he made a mistake in the interpretation of the characters he created, and misunderstood the unexpressed philosophy of the art peculiarly his own. Richard Wagner allowed himself to be misled by Hegel's influence till the middle of his life, and did the same again when he read Schopenhauer's doctrine between the lines of his characters, and began to express himself with such terms as "will," "genius," and "sympathy." Nevertheless, it will remain true that nothing is more counter to Schopenhauer's spirit than the essentially Wagnerian element in Wagner's heroes. I mean, the innocence of the supremest selfishness, the belief in strong passion as a good in itself, in a word, the Siegfried trait in the countenances of his heroes. All that still smacks more of Spinoza than of me, Schopenhauer probably would have said. Whatever good reasons, therefore, Wagner might have had to be on the outlook for other philosophers than Schopenhauer, the enchantment to which he succumbed in respect of this thinker not only made him blind towards all other philosophers, but even towards science itself. His entire art is more and more inclined to become the counterpart and complement of the Schopenhauerian philosophy, and it always renounces more emphatically the higher ambition to become the counterpart and complement of human knowledge and science. And not only is he allured thereto by the whole mystic pomp of this philosophy (which would also have allured a Cagliostro), the peculiar airs and emotions of the philosopher have all along been seducing him as well. For example, Wagner's indignation about the corruption of the German language is Schopenhauerian. And if one should commend his imitation in this respect, it is nevertheless not to be denied that Wagner's style itself suffers in no small degree from all the tumours and turgidities, the sight of which made Schopenhauer so furious, and that, in respect to the German writing Wagnerians, Wagneromania is beginning to be as dangerous as only some kinds of Hegeliomania have been. Schopenhauerian is Wagner's hatred of the Jews, to whom he is unable to do justice, even in their greatest exploit. Are not the Jews the inventors of Christianity? The attempt of Wagner to construe Christianity as a seed blown away from Buddhism, and his endeavour to initiate a Buddhistic era in Europe, under a temporary approximation to Catholic Christian formulas and sentiments, are both Schopenhauerian. Wagner's preaching in favour of pity in dealing with animals is Schopenhauerian. Schopenhauer's predecessor